Okay, so good morning, good afternoon, maybe good evening for everyone. Thank you very much for attending this webinar on the topic of aquaculture and ocean energy. I present myself. I'm Yann Hervé de Roec. So I'm actually the chairman of the Ocean Energy System Technological Collaboration Program, which is in fact an international collaboration, a set of experts, international experts under the umbrella of the International Energy Agency. And we all work together over the topics related to ocean energy. So here, indeed, oh, I can't click on the next slide, sorry. Okay, so I wanted to just to say that, so you see the flags of 22 countries plus the European Commission that are members of this set of experts. And they are not only people from various countries and from various parts of the world, but also from very diversified representation of stakeholders, in fact, in this executive committee. And in fact, what we want to do is to build connection, to really collaborate, and you'll see today a very good example by this study, which has been performed not only by the US and by Australia, but also with connection to all places in the world and with data that have been provided by our delegates in some cases. So yes, well, we all collaborate to be an international voice on ocean energy and to accelerate the viability, the uptake, and the acceptance of ocean energy systems in an environmentally acceptable manner. And what is better to give an example as aquaculture, and you see tonight, so these topics being developed. So in our not daily work, but in our work as a set of experts, we edit and publish reports. And I've just wanted to show 4 of them, which are somehow very closely related to the topic we have tonight. So one is about ocean energy in the islands and remote coastal areas, and what the opportunities and challenges for ocean energy there. You have 2 of them about yes, blue economy and promising markets for ocean energy and alternative markets for ocean energy. One is a set of interviews, which are very interesting to read. And of course, this newly published report on offshore aquaculture, which can be considered really as a market for ocean renewable energy. So all these reports can be downloaded on our website. And by the way, we publish every year an annual report, from which also every 2 years we publish highlights on the giving example on projects on, for instance, tidal or wave energy devices. And we also have webinars like tonight on the very focusing on country reports by, I would say, continents or by part of the world. And the next one will be in June with country reports from India, Singapore, and Korea. And another next one after will be in November with reports in Europe from France, Sweden, Netherlands, and Portugal. So really, I wish you to have a very interesting webinar right now. And I'm very happy to listen to Mikaela, Lysel, and Eloise tonight. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Yann Hervé. And I'm just going to go through a few housekeeping items while we switch over our slide decks. So first of all, you may have noticed that we are recording this presentation. We are going to make it available on the OES website later, so it will be recorded. And I also want to note that while we're presenting today, please feel free to write any questions you have in the chat. You can send them to the general chat, or if you'd like, you can send them directly to myself, Eloise, Lysel, or Haley, and we'll make sure to do our best to answer those. So first of all, thank you everyone for joining us today as we talk about our newly released report, Offshore Aquaculture, a Market for Ocean Renewable Energy. This report was produced by myself and Lysel Garavelli from Pacific Northwest National Lab, Eloise Wilson from the Blue Economy Cooperative Research Center, Mark Kiemer from the Commonwealth Scientific and Industrial Resource Organization, and Michael Abundo and Ed Travis from OceanPixel. So today we'll be walking through the report to provide an overview of the information and highlight some of our key findings and recommendations. Next slide, please. So I'm going to start off by quickly defining ocean renewable energy, or ORE. When I say this, I mean all forms of energy derived directly from the seas and oceans. And so this includes wave, tidal, and ocean current energy, as well as ocean thermal energy conversion, or OTEC, and salinity gradient. Recently, the ORE industry has begun to look at alternative markets, as you heard from Juan Hervé, and specifically today we'll focus on aquaculture as one of those markets. Aquaculture is a growing industry, and due to several factors, it's starting to move offshore and look at that as a prospect. This presents a potential opportunity for ORE to pair with aquaculture and provide power, and it also provides an opportunities for sustainable marine development through co-location of activities. I do want to note in our report, and when we talk about it today, when we say co-location, we mean both the shared use of space and resources, as well as ORE providing power to aquaculture. Next slide, please. So overall, the goal of this report was to assess offshore aquaculture as a key market for ORE. We did this by evaluating technologies and their use for aquaculture, identifying available information on aquaculture power requirements, presenting case studies that included both research projects and pilot demonstration projects, and describing challenges and opportunities for co-location, all to be able to provide initial recommendations to increase the possibility for aquaculture as a market. Throughout this report, while we will focus on offshore aquaculture, we do discuss all forms of aquaculture to understand the industry as a whole and to bring information and learning as the offshore industry is still new. Next slide, please. As Jan Hervé mentioned, OES is really focuses on this international collaboration aspect. And so I just wanted to take a minute to talk about kind of how we incorporated that in our methods for this report. So throughout the development of the report, we coordinated with other nations to better understand aquaculture and associated power requirements on a global scale, to be able to assess the suitability of ORE to meet those requirements. And one of the main reasons for this is because information, especially those on energy demands of aquaculture, is not widely available in the literature. And so this collaboration was really necessary in compiling all the information you see in this report. We collaborated with the OES, or Ocean Energy Systems Executive Committee country representatives to reach aquaculture experts across the different countries. And we also collaborated with two institutions, Aquaterra and the Universidad Austral de Chile, to provide their experiences and expertise in this area. The nations that we were able to receive information from includes Australia, Canada, China, France, Ireland, Japan, Singapore, Spain, the UK, and the US, all of which are OES nations, as well as information from Belgium, Chile, Norway, and the Philippines. And lastly, we spoke with many ORE developers and aquaculture operators internationally regarding case studies, which I'll hear more about later, and to gain more in-depth knowledge about the potential for co-location. The information contained in the report comes from articles, reports, and from these experts. And so for the rest of the presentation today, we'll walk through that information provided in each chapter of the report. Next slide, please. So in chapter 2, we reviewed ORE resources and technologies, discussing where each of these are in their development and their technical attributes for co-location. I do want to note that throughout this report, we also included solar PV and offshore wind in discussions, as these are other renewable energies that have either already been used to power aquaculture or they're being considered. We don't go into great detail about either one, but we do acknowledge their application to understand when they might be best fit, to compare them to ORE, and to pull out lessons learned. So ORE includes a large diversity of technologies, allowing for a wide variety of applications and use in different locations. So for instance, wave energy, while it may be applicable for different types of aquaculture operations, it may be particularly well suited for offshore as the aquaculture industry moves to these more energetic wave environments, whereas tidal energy may be best suited for nearshore applications, as it's typically sited closer to shore and in restricted channels, so it could be placed in, say, tidal streams adjacent to nearshore operations. There are also differences in technology readiness levels, or TRLs, for each of these that may impact their usability. TRLs are globally adopted metrics that are used to track progress of these ORE technologies and to aid their systematic development for in situ use. And they're related to these technology-specific challenges such as reliability, survivability, maintainability, and affordability. And so TRLs 1 to 3 are technologies that are really at early research levels, whereas TRLs 7 through 9 are those at full-scale systems demonstrations. As shown on the figure here in this slide, ORE technologies range from TRL 4 to 9, with tidal and wave technologies having the highest TRLs. Next slide, please. So when assessing renewable energy for powering aquaculture, there were some common advantages that I wanted to pull out today, as well as challenges. The advantages are the ability to reduce or remove requirements for fuel at offshore locations, which in turn avoids the potentials for spills and other associated environmental impacts. There's also potential to save costs by providing power at sea or using on-site resources, and also to integrate systems such as hybrid systems. So for example, pairing, say, solar and wave energy or using battery storage systems. In addition, they allow for scaling technologies to different sized aquaculture operations. Some challenges we saw include the high cost of these technologies, as well as the fact that high energy sites may not be ideal or suitable for aquaculture. So for instance, aquaculture operations typically have a maximum wave climate or current speed or other parameters that they can operate within, both in terms of their ability to carry out operations like feeding or in terms of safety. And in addition, some technologies are still in early stages of development, as shown in the previous slide. And with different renewable sources, there's potential for resource variability or intermittency, which is important to consider as aquaculture operations require reliable power. Next slide, please. So based on our assessment in the report, there's a few ORE technologies that seem to be better suited for offshore operations, which includes wave energy converters, or WEC. There's an example at the top of this slide. Ocean current devices, another example in the middle of this slide, and then OTEC devices, which you'll see on the bottom. And I do want to note these are just one example, but each of these can come in a variety of different device formats. So the table shown here, it's a condensed version from the report only showing these 3 technologies, but I wanted to pull out those that we found may be better suited for offshore aquaculture. And you'll find that we detail in the full table the potential advantages and challenges for all of the technologies I've mentioned so far. So to pull out some examples from this condensed table, for WECs, they have the ability or the potential to be suitable for onshore, nearshore, and offshore aquaculture sites due to the wide variety of devices available, which can be placed on the seabed, they can be floating in the water column or on the surface, or they can be attached to structures such as piers. However, high energy sites may not be ideal or suitable, as I mentioned before. These can be challenging for general operation and maintenance and for aquaculture equipment that's not built for these purposes, though the aquaculture industry is developing submersible net pens and other technologies that will make this more feasible. OTEC is another example here that's also well suited. This is a really predictable resource. It's available year round. It's suitable for onshore, nearshore, and offshore aquaculture sites. And the OTEC infrastructure has the potential to be used for feeding systems and other aspects of the aquaculture operations. However, OTEC is only suitable in tropical and subtropical locations, so its range of use is a little bit limited. And like other ORE technologies, it has a high cost of technology installation. So overall in this chapter, we present a general overview of these advantages and challenge for each of the renewable technologies. The inclusion of these technologies will require several kind of pre-development activities to integrate ORE with aquaculture, including techno-economic analysis, engineering design, and optimization. But we do think that there's a path forward here with a range of opportunities, and there seems to be really great interest from the aquaculture industry to explore these renewable energy sources, especially as they move towards achieving more sustainable operations. Next slide, please. So in chapter 3 of this report, we discuss the aquaculture industry, both the current status of the industry and energy needs. So first, aquaculture is defined as the cultivation of seaweed, crustaceans, shellfish, and finfish for human consumption, for protein source as feed, ornamental trade, or cosmetics and other purposes such as biofuels. Aquaculture, both land and marine-based, accounts for just under 50% of global fish production. And in 2018, the FAO noted that marine-based aquaculture alone produced 30 million tons globally. Offshore aquaculture is a novel aspect of this sector, and I do want to mention that there's really no standard definition that exists when we say offshore aquaculture. So far, it's been defined by depth, by distance from shore, or generally by being located in an exposed environment. To date, there's really only a small number of operations, and some examples include Norway's Ocean 1 farm, shown here on the right, a finfish farm that's 30 kilometers off the coast and has the capacity to hold 1 million salmon, as well as China's Deep Blue 1, which is 48 kilometers off the coast with a capacity for 200,000 salmon. Other offshore operations are in development or being considered, and there also includes many novel designs and ideas for offshore farming. So I think there's a lot to come in this industry. Next slide, please. As I mentioned before, we worked with the OES Executive Committee country representatives to contact aquaculture experts in each country, who we asked to provide us information about the current status of the aquaculture industry. In the appendix to the report, you'll find the information gathered from these experts. On this slide is a portion of that information that we included in the main body of the report, which includes the type of aquaculture grown in each country, and it focuses on offshore aquaculture, specifically if any current operations exist offshore, if there are expansion plans in place for moving offshore, and if ORE is suitable for aquaculture in that country. I won't go into this whole table, but to highlight a few examples, in Australia, finfish, shellfish, crustaceans, and seaweed are all grown, and there are current offshore operations, as well as the industry is planning to continue to expand more into offshore environments, especially in regards to salmon farming in Tasmania, which you'll hear more about later. And there's suitability here in Australia for ORE to power aquaculture operations offshore. In Chile, finfish, shellfish, and seaweed are all grown, and there are currently no offshore operations, but the Chilean government and aquaculture industry do intend to expand finfish operations offshore. And it was noted that for Chile, ORE suitability will depend, but there is large potential for floating wind and wave energy. So with that overview of the current status of the aquaculture industry, I'm going to hand it off to Eloise to talk about energy requirements.
Thanks, Mikaela. So as Mikaela's previously mentioned, a large focus for this study was understanding the energy demands for different aquaculture operations. So to achieve this, we contacted industry partners, university researchers, and we also looked into a number of reports and any available literature that we could find. So in our final report, we've outlined the energy demands of around 6 aquaculture operations around the world, and I'll go through each of them briefly today. So the first example that I'd like to share is a salmon aquaculture operation in Australia. So the figure you can see on the slide here is a summary of a study led by the Blue Economy Cooperative Research Centre in 2020. And in that study, they modelled the energy demands for an offshore salmon operation with an annual production rate of around 10,000 tonnes of fish head-on gutted. So this study estimated that the energy inputs associated with vessel movements and also diesel for powering on-site generators would be around 9,000 kilowatt hours per day, while the daily stationary electrical demand of things such as feed barge operations, lighting, bathing, monitoring, and domestic use would total around 6,000 kilowatt hours per day. Next slide, please. So the second example that I'd like to share is a reference energy consumption for salmon aquaculture operations in Chile. So different to the Australian example, which I've just gone through, which was in an offshore environment, the salmon aquaculture operations in Chile are generally located in nearshore environments and may have a production capacity ranging anywhere from 25,000 to around 60,000 individual fish. So the energy demand of salmon aquaculture operations in Chile is known to change based on variables such as fish growth, different health requirements, and it also changes a lot depending on the seasonality of operations. So for this example in our report, we averaged the energy demand across a number of different salmon producers in Chile. And then from there, we averaged the energy use across the year to determine a cumulative energy demand of around 371 kilowatt hours per day. Next slide, please. So the third example that I'll share from our recently published report is a salmon aquaculture example from Norway. So generally speaking, Norwegian salmon farms are located in nearshore environments, and oftentimes the Norwegian salmon farms are connected to the grid, which makes mapping their energy demands a relatively straightforward operation. So a study in 2019 led by Moller investigated the energy demands across the entire Norwegian salmon aquaculture industry. And they used data from both grid-connected farms and also farms that were diesel reliant. So we've summarized the results of this study in our report. And as you can see on the slide here, we've highlighted that the cumulative energy demand for Norwegian salmon is around 700 kilowatt hours per day. And that's based off a production capacity of around 3,120 tonnes. Next slide, please. So for our next example, we were able to access information directly from the barramundi or Asian sea bass producers in Singapore. So different to the previous three examples that I've just gone through of salmon aquaculture, EcoArc is a closed aquaculture system and it produces around 166 tonnes of sea bass each year. So as you can see on the figure, in the figure on the slide here, we also acquired details of their operations that included nursery, sea intake pumps, dissolved oxygen pumps, ice makers, harvest preparation, and we also were able to get information on the post-harvest factory for packaging. So from all this information, we use the annual energy consumption to determine the cumulative energy demand of 9,416 kilowatt hours per day. Next slide, please. So the final example that I'd like to highlight is the energy demands associated with shellfish aquaculture. So here we present two examples from Scotland. On the left-hand side of the screen, you can see the Pacific oyster, and on the right-hand side, the blue mussel. So the Scottish oyster farms that we used for this report used both electricity for sea pumps, grading machines, lighting, and other domestic services. And they also used diesel for vessels, vehicles, and generators. So based on that information, the annual energy demand we determined for Pacific oysters grown in Scotland was around 343 kilowatt hours per day. And then when looking at the Scottish blue mussel, a study in 2011 indicated that the energy consumption for blue mussel aquaculture typically included diesel for vessels, vehicles, and also on-site generators. And their operations also included electricity for seawater pumps, grading machines, and also any general and domestic services. So again, it was from this information that we determined that the cumulative energy demand for the Scottish blue mussel to be around 1,200 kilowatt hours per day. And that was again based off annual estimates. Next slide, please. So the final part of this energy demand analysis was looking overall at the energy demands by species and by country. So you can see the figure on the right-hand side of the screen. It summarizes the energy demand for several farmed aquaculture species, and that's based off the figures that I've just presented to you. So these individual energy demands were standardized, and we used kilowatt hours per tonne per year in order for us to compare the relative energy use for each aquaculture operation. So as you can see in the figure, there is a notable difference in the energy demands across countries that farm the same species. And we can see that in the Pacific oyster and also the Atlantic salmon examples. So I'll just speak briefly about why we might be observing some of these differences in the Atlantic salmon examples. So as I mentioned before, the Australian Atlantic salmon example was modelled in an offshore environment, while the other examples were modelled in nearshore environments. So we thought that that might be one of the major drivers of these differences. So the second part of the summary analysis was looking at the difference in energy use across different farmed species. So as you can see, there is quite a big difference across the different species, and that's likely just to be due to the difference in the operational needs across all of them. For example, if we look at the high energy use for the Asian sea bass example, that again might be due to the operation requiring an automated system, and that then requires the need for water filtration, sterilization, aeration pumps. And that's again because they're a closed containment aquaculture system, as opposed to the extrinsic nature of the Atlantic salmon and the shellfish examples. Additionally, as well, I mentioned before that the Asian sea bass example included a post-harvest handling within their energy demand. So that's likely to increase the overall cumulative energy demand for that example operation. So overall, this section of our report really highlighted the need for more detailed and finer resolution data. So moving forward, collecting this data of this nature will help shed a light on these differences further, and it will overall help us better understand the energy demands and how they might vary across different aquaculture operations. Next slide, please. So now that we know a little bit more about the energy demands for different aquaculture operations, the next section of our report looked at case studies. So for this, we explored projects that have previously used ocean renewable energy technologies to meet the demands of aquaculture. So as you can see on the slide here, we've included case studies from 5 OES countries. So we have Australia, China, France, Singapore, and the United States. And we've also included case studies from 3 non-OES countries. So that's Cabo Verde, Scotland, and also Wales. So within these case studies, we've included all marine-based aquaculture types. So that includes finfish, shellfish, crustaceans, and also seaweed. And again, for these case studies, we've included operations that spanned nearshore, coastal, and also offshore environments. So as you can see on the map here, within the case studies section of our report, we included 7 projects that incorporated wave energy converters, 1 project which included ocean thermal energy conversion, 2 hybrid case studies, and also 2 projects which used solar technologies. Next slide, please. So I'll just go through a couple of, highlight a couple of the case studies that we looked at in our report. So one of the case studies that we'd like to highlight is the Aquapower Technologies, which is a really good example of nearshore finfish aquaculture and wave energy conversion being paired together. So the Manta device has been designed specifically for remote locations, and that includes being designed specifically for the use in offshore finfish farms. So a little bit about the Manta device. It's a small low-cost wave energy converter, and it has a power capacity of around 4 kilowatt hours. 4 kilowatts, and it's designed to be installed in arrays. So in 2018, a single Manta wave energy converter was installed in a Scottish finfish farm. And the Manta device was installed for a period of around 18 months, during which it was able to produce around 11 megawatts of power. And that power was used to feed into the aquaculture system to be used in these low power operations. So the 18-month test deployment concluded in 2020. However, Aquapower Technologies assured us that they're continuing their efforts to research these alternative power sources for aquaculture systems. Next slide, please. So the next case study that we'd like to highlight is the Hawaii Ocean Science and Technology Park, or HOST Park. as it provides a really great example of ocean thermal energy conversion, providing power to onshore aquaculture. So HosePark is a research facility that uses sustainable and innovative ocean renewable energy to support approximately 80% of Hawaii's aquaculture and marine production. So the park was originally founded in 1974, and since its inception, it's expanded to cover an 870-acre area, and currently it has more than 50 tenants using the facility for scientific research, energy and ocean technology research and development, food production, water desalination, and it also includes aquaculture as well. So within HosePark, there have been a number of projects that have been developed and currently a number of projects that are still developing. However, a notable project that I'd like to highlight is a closed cycle ocean thermal energy prototype. And that prototype generated over 105 kilowatts of power and was used to be integrated into the grid. Next slide, please. So the next case study that I'd like to talk about is an example of wave energy converters being used to support offshore finfish aquaculture in China. So the Guangzhou Institute of Energy Conversion and the Chinese Academy of Sciences developed a wave energy converter that can be integrated with an offshore floating aquaculture platform. And this floating aquaculture platform is known as Penghu. So Penghu was first deployed in 2019, and it's capable of producing 60 kilowatts of wave energy and 60 kilowatts of solar energy. So this energy can be used for a number of things. However, currently it's planned to be used to power crew quarters. It can be used for at-sea monitoring, seawater desalination, and it also has the potential to fulfill the energy needs for an offshore finfish aquaculture cage that's around 10 to 20,000 cubic meters in size. Next slide, please. So the final case study that I'd like to highlight is an Australian example. It's an example that's planning to use wave energy conversion to power finfish operations in offshore environments. So Carnegie Clean Energy and the Blue Economy Cooperative Research Centre began a 3-year project in 2021 to design and install a novel wave energy converter system named MorePower. So you can see a picture of MorePower there on the slides. So this device, MorePower, is designed to provide clean and reliable energy in offshore environments. So the aim is to reduce the reliance on diesel generators that would otherwise have to be used in operations that can't access these shore power. So the primary market for MorePower, as I mentioned, would be energy-intensive offshore aquaculture operations. And the primary goal is for it to replace feed barges and also diesel-powered vessels. So the planned power capacity of Carnegie Clean Energy's MorePower device is 1.5 megawatts per buoy. And there's a planned deployment of the wave energy device offshore in the Carnegie research facility. Next slide, please. So overall, by summarising these 12 unique case studies in our report, we were able to comment on the lessons learned from each of them and then make recommendations on how to progress the uptake of ocean renewable energy devices within aquaculture operations. So one of the main lessons that was learned was generally the overall success and viability of using ocean renewable energies to deliver power to aquaculture operations. So in our report, we've detailed a number of successful co-locations between wave energy devices and finfish aquaculture, wave energy devices and seaweed aquaculture, as well as ocean thermal energy converters for use of onshore aquaculture. However, having said that, we did also identify a number of challenges. So the main challenges that we identified were financial in nature, and they included a lack of funding, a lack of investment, and just the overall high cost of renewable energy technologies. Other challenges that we identified included the uncertain effects of renewable energy devices on aquaculture systems, and also things such as lengthy permitting and regulatory processes. I'll now pass it over to Lysel.
Thanks, Eloise. So for this next chapter, this is chapter 5 of our report, and we talked about the opportunities and challenges of co-locating offshore renewable energy and offshore aquaculture. Because ORE and offshore aquaculture are new industries, these opportunities and challenges can mainly be identified from previous research projects, analogous industries, or case studies, such as the case studies that Eloise just presented. Today, we just wanted to highlight you some of the opportunities and challenges from the research projects we looked into. These research projects are multi-use platform projects that were developed in Europe. So some examples are Marib, Tropos, Muses, Mermaid, or United. A multi-use platform is a joint intentional use of resources in close geographic proximity, and it can have single use or multiple uses. Some examples of marine uses are fisheries, aquaculture, tourism, ORE, or offshore wind. We looked at the main finding from this project to learn more about some opportunities and challenges for co-location. Some main findings were that the stakeholders were engaged in the development of the platform's design, so from the beginning. The selection and planning methodology were transferable between sites. However, the technical methodologies were site-specific and dependent on social components and licensing regulation. It was found that there was a high cost of offshore equipment related to limited investment. And for the projects that included wave energy and aquaculture, it was found that there was some cost saving related to share operation and maintenance, limited environmental effects, and a guaranteed sale of electricity from the wave energy device to the aquaculture operation. Some of the opportunities and challenges we highlighted in chapter 5 of our report were specific to some countries, and here we are highlighting today some 4 countries for opportunities and challenges for co-location. So let's start with Australia, where there are large ORE resources with wave and tidal mainly. And in Australia, the aquaculture sector accounts for 36% of the total seafood production. Salmonids are the most valuable products in Australia, with 98% of salmonid production value coming from Tasmania. ORE is supported by the Blue Economy Cooperative Research Centre in Australia, so the B CRC. And the B CRC include industry, government, and research partners from 10 countries. B CRC has some research focus on aquaculture, marine renewable energy, maritime engineering, or environmental assessments. And the B CRC has proposed offshore developments with integrated system for Atlantic salmon production that will use ORE. There are several ongoing projects under the B CRC, and some of them, we have some example on the right here of the slides with deployment of wave energy device in Albany and projects on logistics challenges to offshore or high energy co-location of aquaculture and energy industries. In Chile, where there are also large wave resources, the ORE development and research has been supported by the creation of the Marine Energy Research and Innovation Center, MERIC. MERIC has several research projects on ORE, and there is an ongoing WEC pilot project, so wave energy convector pilot project, for several applications, and one being aquaculture. Chile is in the top 10 aquaculture exporter, and it's also the second largest salmon producer. So there are high opportunities to co-locate aquaculture and ORE in Chile. And the government identified the need for clean energy in the aquaculture sector. What's interesting in Chile is that offshore development is starting to be developed. Offshore aquaculture is also starting to be developed. So we can see on the bottom right here an example of an offshore aquaculture vessel concept that has been developed by OceanPixel. And this vessel is aiming to have a production of fish up to 3,900 tons. So this vessel will be offshore, and it will be a good opportunity to use ORE for powering this kind of operation. In the Philippines now, there is an estimated ORE resource potential that is pretty large, which is like 170 gigawatt, with wave, tidal, and OTEC. What's interesting in the Philippines is that aquaculture helps address the challenges of poverty. There are suitable aquaculture areas, but they are very remote or they are off-grid. And there are also several national programs and initiatives promoting the use of sustainable energy in Philippines. However, there are challenges in using ORE for aquaculture, such as high capital cost to install, maintain, or repair ORE infrastructure, a lack of equipment and support infrastructure, or a need to have trained professionals for installation, operation, and maintenance. Finally, the last example of a country for opportunities and challenges for co-location is United States, where there is also a large potential of ORE resources with wave, tidal, ocean current, and OTEC. What's interesting in US is that 70 to 85% of the seafood is imported. However, there is a continued interest in growing the aquaculture sector. There is an increased policy support from the US government for offshore aquaculture with, for example, the development of study areas for aquaculture opportunity areas to aid siting. And there is also some support from the US Department of Energy to assess the feasibility for co-locating wave energy and offshore aquaculture. There are some ongoing projects at PNNL to identify areas with adequate wave resources for wave energy and favorable conditions for aquaculture operation. So you can see an example for Hawaii on the right here. So if we want to summarize all these opportunities and challenges, and there are all, again, more in the report, what we did here is we gather them under 3 themes. So this table is available in the report, but I'm just going to give some example today. So under this theme, technical and operational processes, some example of opportunities are shared systems and equipment, or improved energy security and reliability. However, some of the challenges are the limited energy storage and the low level of ORE device commercialization. Under the theme regulatory processes, some opportunities for co-location are reduced environmental effects, for example, less carbon emission, and also a sustainable and efficient use of the marine space. Some challenges are potential cumulative effects and also the need to resolve different priorities of various stakeholders. Finally, under the theme economic impact, some examples of opportunities are cost saving associated with sharing equipment and operation, or the potential for increased market value of aquaculture products grown using ORE. Some challenges are more financial support needed and also a high upfront capital expenditure. So we are finishing the last chapter, chapter 6 of our report is about recommendation. This recommendation were identified based on the information gathered in the report, all of this information and more that we presented you today. And these recommendations are made to hopefully expand the opportunities for co-location between ORE and offshore aquaculture. So again, these recommendations were gathered under the 3 similar themes that I just presented. With technical and operational processes, including daily operation or monitoring and maintenance. Recommendation on regulatory processes that include planning, siting, or licensing. And also we have recommendation on economic impact, which include economic effects, funding, or investment. So some example right now of this recommendation. So for technical and operational processes, we recommend a better assessment of energy needs of aquaculture operation. There is a need to have final resolution data, energy needs profile, and a better consistency in reporting. We also recommend the use of hybrid system that will ensure a continuous supply of energy by combining ORE with other sources of energy. And here there are recommendations on the use of hybrid barges. For the regulatory processes, there are recommendations on assessing environmental and social effects that will help better understand the impacts of co-locating ORE and offshore aquaculture. There is a need to develop consistent data collection methods and also compare between the project. We also recommend to engage with aquaculture stakeholders, and here there is a need to identify the communities, also a need to have transparent and early processes of engagement, and also to develop policies to enable co-location. Finally, for planning and licensing, there is a need to develop framework that foster co-location and also to have roadmap for co-location. For economic impact, there is a need of having investment support and there is a need of having funding or investment support, especially from governments. And also there is a need to promote the research studies and pilot co-located projects. Overall, if we want to expand opportunities for co-locating offshore aquaculture and ORE, there is a clear need for international collaboration and information exchange to identify the knowledge gaps, the lessons learned, the challenges to overcome, and help develop research agendas. So all of this information that Mikaela, Eloise, and I just presented are now available in our reports that was released yesterday. You can see the link here on the slide, and this link is going to be shared in the chat soon. If you have your phone handy, you can scan the QR code available on the slides and you will access directly our report. And if you want more information on the Ocean Energy System Alternative Market for Ocean Energy Task, you can also go to this link that also will be added on the chat, and I think it has been added already. We would like to thank you for your attention today. We are very grateful for your attendance. We especially want to thank the Ocean Energy Systems, the Blue Economy Cooperative Research Center, and the US Department of Energy, Water, Power Technologies Office for their support. And we also would like to thank our contributors, Sarah Murray and Fiona Makisaak from Aquaterra, and Gonzalo Tempier from Universidad Austral de Chile. Thank you, and we now can take some questions. I'm going to stop sharing.
Great. Can you all hear me again?
Yes.
Perfect. All right. We have a few questions that came in through the chat. And while we're talking right now, feel free to put additional questions for us in the chat. I'll ask that you send them directly to me if possible, or you can send them to everyone in the meeting as well. And you should see both those links that Lysel mentioned in the chat as well. The first one being for accessing the report directly, and the second one for that alternative markets for ocean energy OESE task page. So the first question we received is, what is your recommendation to collect energy demands of aquaculture operations? I don't know if anyone wants to take a stab at it, or I can start that one. Eloise, do you want to address that one first?
Yeah, definitely. So as I mentioned previously, when we were looking at the Norwegian example, we had a lot of success mapping the energy demands for the entire, or previous researchers, sorry, have had a lot of success mapping the energy demands across the Norwegian Atlantic salmon aquaculture industry by being able to access grid connected data. So I think a great jumping off point for collecting sort of fine resolution aquaculture data would be accessing these aquaculture farms that are grid connected and seeing if we can collect data that way, which is obviously a lot easier if the farms are connected to the grid. But we can also look at diesel usage as well and make a conversion into energy. Yeah, that's sort of what I would say initially.
Great, thank you, Eloise. Anyone else? And I should mention we have Mike Obundo here with us from OceanPixel, one of the authors who will also help us answer questions as well. Thanks, Mike. All right, so the next question I just got was, why wasn't offshore wind one of the major ORE resources considered for co-location with offshore aquaculture? And under the OES initiative, offshore wind is not considered one of the ORE technologies. So we've focused on wave, tides, ocean currents, OTEC, and salinity gradients, as we mentioned, but there's a lot of consideration of offshore wind, particularly floating offshore wind being able to power aquaculture. So as I mentioned, we do talk about it a little bit, but because it's not included as an OES technology, it wasn't the main focus of this report, but certainly a lot to learn between the two industries. All right, one other question we got is why, this is for you, Eloise, on I think it's on that last slide, you presented a figure of the energy demands, comparing them across countries and species. So why is Singapore bass production needing almost 10 times energy of other sites?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and one that we all talked about a lot as a team. So I think there's two major reasons that we're seeing such a higher energy demand for the Asian sea bass as opposed to the Atlantic salmon. So the first reason is Atlantic salmon, if we look at that initially, so that's grown as partially extensive aquaculture. So that pretty much means that there's no need for water filtration, aeration, or water heating, as the fish are largely grown in situ in the marine environment. But then looking at the Asian sea bass example, that's a largely intensive operation. And that pretty much means that the Asian sea bass require constant water aeration, water filtration, and water heating or cooling, depending on the seasons. So that would drive the energy consumption up. And then also when I presented earlier, I mentioned that the Asian sea bass example also includes post-harvest storage, preparation, and also packaging. So none of the other examples that we included, we didn't have access, to any other examples that included any post-harvest or harvest energy demands in their profiles. So yeah, when considering the Asian sea bass example, I think it's those two main things that are really driving that energy consumption up compared to the other examples that we've looked at.
Great, thank you, Eloise.
Thanks.
I am just reading questions as they come in. So one question here, let me read this while I ask it out loud. ORE resources can be variable throughout the year. What would be the best approach to continuously use ORE for powering offshore aquaculture? Lysel or Mike, Lysel, you want to start?
Yeah, I can start, and Mike, please feel free to chime in. I think one of the main options would be, and we talked about that a bit, to use hybrid systems. So if we look at wave energy, for example, in some of the region, like what we look in US, in winter, the wave energy is great, but in summer it's not ideal. However, summer is good for solar energy. So having some hybrid systems that would combine wave energy and solar energy will be a good way to compensate this variability of the ORE resources. Mike, if you have
I second that hybridization approach. You'd also want to look at obviously some energy storage systems, coupling that with that hybrid system. And I think you will have some form of fossil fuel based backup in the interim, but the ambition of having just purely ocean renewable energy would probably lean on having either a baseload type of ORE coming in or a combination depending on the site. That's it, Mikaela.
Thank you. All right. So we got another question on offshore wind. This one is asking, do we think that offshore wind is more competitive to ORE and maybe dominating due to TRL, that technology readiness level and commercializing level? And so I'll just take first go at that one, and then you all can jump in with anything else. Offshore wind, from what we found in literature, has mainly been looked at in the sharing of space. So using, say, fixed offshore wind platforms to put an aquaculture system within those platforms, or and share that space, but not necessarily to power aquaculture operations. So we didn't find many examples of assessments where offshore wind was actually powering aquaculture. This may change as floating wind becomes more of a technology that's used. Right now, it's also a very novel industry, but being explored heavily in many countries. And so that is something to keep an eye on, and could be an example of maybe a hybrid system of offshore wind and maybe an ORE technology or whatnot. Anyone else want to jump in there?
I can add a bit on. I think the difficulty like one of the difficulty for offshore wind will be the complexity of deploying a turbine in a already existing sites. Whereas if you think about a wave energy converter, that is more scalable, that easier, like if you choose a site existing aquaculture site, you would be able to easily deploy one in a wave energy converter, and like it won't be easy to have a bottom-mounted offshore wind turbine. But I think more research is definitely needed on the opportunities to combine these two industries.
Could I add on that, Mikaela?
Yeah.
So I think we have to acknowledge that there are technologies that are more mature in terms of the technology readiness level, and I think the observation of offshore wind being more mature than the ORE or most of the ORE options. It's true. We're not saying that we should just look at ORE, but I think the hybridization also includes technologies like wind turbines, maybe smaller versions of wind turbines, and not necessarily large ones, depending on the scale of the operations. And I think if it's a new area, we might be able to consider joint or cooperative planning of the space to include different technology options. So I don't think we are close to having different renewable energy technologies co-locate and work with offshore aquaculture per se. That being said, there may be also other areas where offshore wind simply does not exist as a resource, and I think it's on a project-to-project or case-to-case basis in terms of how we develop and size up the systems. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. All right, a question that just came in is, if an aquaculture cage is equipped with a WEC, wave energy converter, is there any advantage for damping the overall motion already considered? And on the other hand, is there any over-design needed in such a case? And so I think this question, and Jan Hervé, correct me if I'm interpreting it incorrectly, is looking at can wave energy converters reduce the wave climate behind the device?
Exactly.
Perfect. Yeah, so this is something that there's a lot of interest in, and there's not a lot of in situ studies and information on it. So we do mention it in our report as a potential advantage of using a wave energy converter, but that there's really more information needed to truly understand if that WEC device or other ORE technologies can provide kind of a dampening of that wave energy motion. Does anyone else have anything to add there? Go ahead, Mike.
Yep. I think the logical short answer would be that there could be a lot of advantage for dampening the motion considered. I mean, most aquaculture farms, at least those that we have in the tropical region, locate their areas in not so energetic sites in terms of waves. And I think dampening the waves or the wave climate in an area could actually benefit the operational aspects of the fish farm. But again, there's not a lot of literature on this, and whether or not that may have some impact on the quality of the species being farmed out. Maybe they like having more resistance or energy because it encourages, I don't know, certain types of muscle growth. But so I think there needs to be more study on this. But just on the structural perspective and operations, I think having less wave in an aquaculture site means to have better windows of operations and less wear and tear and maintenance on the structures. So over designing, I think this is taken on a case-by-case basis, but so there's already something to be investigated there in terms of benefits from an engineering perspective. Yeah.
Thank you, Mike. Excellent. Well, I think there are so many other questions that we got, so thank you for sending those in, and apologies we couldn't get to them all today, but we will end there. We'll want to be respectful of everyone's time, but thank you for joining us today. We greatly appreciate it, and we hope you will all read our report. I've put the link again in the chat, and just thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, folks.
Thank you very much, and congratulations.
Thank you, Yana Ray.